This Week in Virology, the podcast about viruses, the kind that make you sick. From Microbe TV, this is TWiV, This Week in Virology, episode 1010, recorded on May 24th, 2023. I'm Vincent Racaniello, and you're listening to the podcast all about viruses. Joining me today from New York, Daniel Griffin.
Hello, everyone.
So I could have said 1010, right, instead of 1010. There's a radio station, right? 1010 wins. I don't know.
Exactly. Well, hopefully this is going to be a 10-10 wins.
Okay, let's hear it.
And I will, I put in my show notes, a heads up, Vincent, I'm going to be hoping to pull you in for lots of discussion. I think there's a few discussion topics here. And
all right.
well, if you jump in, that's good. If you don't, then people know that, anyway. Okay, let's start with our quotation. I'm wearing my coronavirus, my nice coronavirus bow tie here. So people can enjoy that if you're watching on YouTube. But my quotation, I do not believe in any wise man until I have heard him say, I doubt it 3 times and I don't know 2 times. And I think that's really important. There's a lot of people out there who have just always been right and have not. So let's try to bring some humility. I think that's what science is about. Science is not about confirmation bias. It's about learning. It's about discovery. But I'm going to start right up front with HIV. And I'm going to start with the CDC HIV surveillance report. And why, in a moment, I think people will understand why I'm talking about this right up front. So this just came out, right? And as we've talked about before, it takes a little while for all the data to be put together. But here we hear that we saw over 36,000 new diagnoses of HIV in 2021, just right here in the United States. Now, I read a few articles, really interesting ways that people are spinning this. So this is up from 2020 by 5,000. So I did that 2020 there, 5,551, but down from 2016 by 2,655. So I've seen people spin it both ways there. Now they say things like only about 20% of the new diagnoses in the U.S. are in women. So only 20%, 1 in 5 are in women. Then still predominantly impacting those with male-to-male intimate contact. But about 1 in every 3 is outside this population. The majority of new diagnoses are actually now occurring in the U.S. South. So the majority, over 50% of the new cases, not California, not New York, but down in that Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, Alabama, Texas region, majority.
Hey, here's another way to look at it, Daniel.
Yes.
That's 98 new infections every day or 4 every hour.
Yeah.
1 every 15 minutes. It's a lot.
That's a lot. So I put this right up front because I'm going to put forth this crazy idea that HIV/AIDS is still a pandemic with an estimated 34 to 44 million people globally living with HIV, an estimated 1 to 2 million people newly infected with HIV globally each year, and somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people dying each year from AIDS-related diseases. So I want to talk a little bit because I'm going to be asking this question in a moment. What is a pandemic? Why do you call this a pandemic? So I want to share a story that I found quite upsetting. And this was actually early on in my time practicing clinical medicine at Columbia. And it was started off with a young man who came in, freshman at Columbia University, a student. He had met a girl. This was his first physical intimacy experience of his life. But he was having a number of issues. And as part of a screening, he had actually had an HIV test and tested positive. He was completely shocked. Then turned out his girlfriend, with which this was his first and monogamous sexual experience, she also tested positive. This was her second sexual exposure. So obviously her first exposure. And he was just shocked, as was she. And just, what is going on? Why did I not know that I should be aware of this? And I remember at the time trying to get one of the major newspapers to do an article just on the fact that we are still in a situation where unprotected sex can carry this risk with it. So here's the issue. What is a pandemic? And here is the problem as I see it, and hoping Vincent will have some comments as well. I see you getting ready to jump in.
Well,
Now,
we had a nice discussion with Maria von Kerkhove and Kanta Subarao, right? You probably heard that.
well, I heard that. I'm actually responding to that.
Okay.
So I will say that because of poor communication, for most people, the HIV/AIDS pandemic has not changed the way they live, work, and play until they're actually surprised by a new diagnosis for themselves, as I just described, their daughter, their son, their friend. So I don't think the definition of a pandemic should be contingent on successful education that results on the degree of understanding that triggers a change in the way people live, work, and play. Maybe a pandemic is just a widespread occurrence of an infectious disease with significant impacts around the world. Now, the problem, as we see with the HIV/AIDS pandemic, is unlike pornography, not everyone recognizes it when they see it. We were well into this COVID-19 pandemic of March 2020, and some people then and even afterwards never really decided that they were going to change the way they lived, worked, or played. And I pasted in a little bit of a graphic just sort of showing over time, this 30 to 40,000, per person new diagnoses here in the United States.
Well, at the beginning of the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic, I was telling reporters, "Did you know there's another pandemic ongoing?" And they didn't know that there was an HIV/AIDS pandemic. So I've always felt that there is one. And then my definition, is it affects everyone without infecting everyone. And people say, "Well, how does HIV/AIDS affect you?" Well, first of all, it took a lot of grant money from other viruses that's affecting me, but also it bothers me that this is happening and we can't understand it and we can't fix it. We can't prevent it. We can't make a vaccine. We can make great antivirals, but I learned recently that they can make you really sick too, right, Daniel? These antivirals.
Yeah, actually, this week we had an issue where it was a young, dental assistant who was assisting and ended up getting a needle stick injury. It was a bloody needle, went through the glove, actually penetrated the skin. They were started on post-exposure prophylaxis. We're all thinking this is good within the first 48 hours. But then they developed this really horrible chest pain. The call I got was from an urgent care provider saying, "This young lady will not take any more of this. It's just the pain is so severe. What are our options?" And so, those of us involved in different areas of the medical profession, there's always a risk. In this case, it was a person who was newly diagnosed, so probably had an incredibly high viral load, so making this a higher risk setting. When I practice in Africa, a lot of places I go, 10-15% of the community is infected. Tremendous impact on the economy, tremendous impact socially, all these children who have lost their parents. And we talked about direct impacts of HIV, but what about the increase in cardiovascular disease, significant increase we're now seeing in cancers? This is an ongoing pandemic. A lot of people are ignoring it. And I think as we move forward, that was Tedros was saying, we're saying this health emergency is ending, but we're not saying forget about it. We're not saying ignore this. We're not saying just move forward and dismantle all the systems you put in place, because COVID-19, it's here to stay.
All right, Daniel. So is there a hepatitis B virus pandemic currently?
Interesting. The only challenge I would say there is how global, right? Because there are certain areas of the world that are not, and I think this is important in defining a pandemic. Certainly in parts of Asia and China, it is a tremendous burden. Right. So it just, and you get sort of into like, does it have to affect everywhere for it to be a pandemic?
How about seasonal coronaviruses. They infect almost everyone, right? Is that a pandemic?
I think this is sort of this judgment when we use the word significant impact, right? There's certain sort of background that we live with, and there's times it rises above that. It's going to be interesting to see, going forward, what is the level of ongoing activity of SARS-CoV-2 relative to those seasonal coronaviruses. But no, I think most of us do not consider. I don't think it would be appropriate to consider the seasonal coronaviruses
Okay.
as pandemic.
Would you say there is a global pandemic of heart disease?
I think yes. And
Hmm.
and I think that's an interesting way, right? Because we normally think, and I have my sort of blinders on, we use infectious disease to talk, about pandemics, but we've applied, the word crisis, the word pandemic to opioid issues, which people are not changing the way they live and work and play, and
Mm.
they probably should. Cardiovascular disease, cancer. Yeah, I think this is tough.
Well, even the WHO people had trouble defining it, right? And it's not easy, um, but I don't think we can restrict it to infectious diseases. I think it's any global condition, which heart disease, diabetes, obesity in certain countries
Yeah, yeah.
can be extremely disruptive. Let's put it that way.
Yeah,
For
the term obesity pandemic, I think is appropriate. I think it communicates a significant, a clear and present danger to the health of human beings throughout the world, and a problem that's growing.
Do we have a stupidity pandemic, Daniel?
No doubt, no doubt.
Okay.
All right, let's move on to some good news. RSV, right? We've been talking about RXV, and now we're going to talk about RSV. On Thursday, May 18th, an advisory panel of the FDA voted in favor of approving the Abrysvo vaccine by Pfizer to prevent severe respiratory virus that is a potentially deadly threat to infants, right? So last time we talked about protecting those 60 and up, right? Saying that, you end up in the hospital with RSV, you're twice as likely not to survive as an influenza hospitalization, 10, 20,000 deaths per year here in the US. Well, what about those kids who flood into the hospital? So this vaccine would be the first to protect babies from RSV. And really, as mentioned, this is the reason many infants are admitted to Children's Hospital each year. And this virus kills several hundred under the age of 5 each year. So 14 agency advisors unanimously agreed that the vaccine was effective. And the FDA typically follows the recommendations of its advisory panels. Now, we discussed the data that led to this recommendation that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. And that was the Matisse trial, where there was an efficacy of around 82% in reducing medically attended severe lower respiratory tract illness due to RSV that occurs within 90 days after birth. So the idea here is that an individual gets the vaccine in the last trimester of pregnancy, and the infants then have this robust protection during that most critical period of time.
And then by 6 months, when antibodies from the mother have lowered, the babies have probably made their own because they've been infected. Is
That's
that
going to be
yeah?
the challenge, right? Because this is only going to last maybe 3 to 6 months, right? That's what we
Mm.
sort of think with the maternal antibodies. Now, if you continue to breastfeed, will you continue to provide some benefit? That's something we'll have to follow. And then what do you do from 6 months to 5? Are we going to have some sort of an infant vaccine on the horizon? So, yeah.
Interesting times where we have two RSV vaccines, one for older people, one for people to be.
Yes. Good times, I dare say. All right, now let's move right into COVID, and I'm going to jump in on testing, and I really like this. So, we're not going to keep you here too long this week. It's going to be Memorial Day weekend when this drops, but we answered some emails last week where it was discussed that many people don't want to test. Well, this is true. Many do want to go into settings where they might get COVID. Maybe this is like getting on an airplane and not wanting people aboard with things that might harm you and others. Is there a way to do this? Is there a way to make these areas safe without sticking swabs up people's noses or other places, like in their mouths? The article canine olfactory detection of SARS-CoV-2 infected humans, a systematic review, was recently published in Annals of Epidemiology. So for background, several diseases are known to produce specific scents in affected individuals, excreted as volatile organic compounds, which can be easily detected by dogs within seconds. Now, I was reading this and it reminded me of a primary care physician who I saw when I was young, who claimed to be able to smell if a person had strep throat, thus saving us all the trouble of testing. Maybe he was smelling the methyl mercaptan. I don't know. But this article is a systematic review that evaluates the current evidence for using dogs' olfactory system as a reliable COVID-19 screening tool. They identified a number of studies with low risk of bias and high quality. They also found some studies that were not so great. The 6 high quality studies revealed sensitivity ranges of 82 to 97% and specificity ranges of 83 to 100%. And we discussed one of these studies where the dogs actually just were walking past the children, actually right behind them. You weren't like putting gauze in cones or anything like that. And so it just interesting thinking about how this might play a role in the future.
Maybe, Daniel, if you have dogs, you could get them trained to sniff COVID, and then you could have a test every day.
So, I have to say, it was really, I spent a lot of time. And by the way, people read this article. It's great. It is amazing how many different breeds of dogs can be trained to do this. It's not like, one specific breed. So I was amazed just the numbers of different dogs. Now, we, as you may know, we actually help foster and train service dogs. A couple of them have gone on to be hearing dogs, right? So they actually hear things and then have paw signals for individuals who are deaf. Ones that help. We actually have an active serviceman who had some trauma overseas. The dog goes into his house, turns on all the lights and lets him know it's safe to enter, allows him to continue to function. These dogs are just amazing. So excited to see that they might have an opportunity. All right, let's move into vaccinations. I'm going to start this section with the article, Safety of the BNT162b2 COVID-19 vaccine in children aged 5 to 17 years, published in JAMA Pediatrics. So these are the results of a cohort study of more than 3 million children aged 5 to 17 who received this is the Pfizer-BioNTech COVID-19 vaccine through mid-2022 using data from 3 U.S. commercial claims databases. Only myocarditis or pericarditis met the statistical threshold for a signal after the vaccination. Now, both myocarditis and pericarditis is a rare post-vaccination event, giving us an incidence of about 39 cases per million doses administered in children aged 5 to 17. And they're looking at that post-vaccination period. They did not, I think this is really important, they did not detect a signal for myocarditis or pericarditis in the younger children, those aged 5 to 11, which is consistent with reports from other surveillance systems. So I think just more and more, when we're having discussions with parents, when we're having discussions about vaccination in the youngest among us, we really, as we talked about last time, we can reinforce messages that are persuasive. This is a safe, well-studied vaccine. We have lots and lots of experience. So this is a safe, effective vaccine. And I think we're all supposed to show in. All the cool kids are doing it. Those that you trust, I vaccinated all my children, or I should say all my children were vaccinated. It was a mutual decision. And I will also throw in no more J&J vaccines in the U.S. All remaining doses here in the U.S. have expired after about 19 million people in the U.S. received this vaccine. Now, we're going to get into some discussion soon. We're going to be hearing more on vaccine compositions June 15th from the US FDA. But we do have some recommendations from the WHO. So first off, we have the statement on the antigen composition of COVID-19 vaccines from the WHO. And this is that 1,616 words document that is suggested to take 6 minutes to read. So I encourage, take the 6 minutes, but a few bullet point takeaways. So here's what they have to say. Despite increasing gaps in genomic surveillance globally, the available sequencing data indicates that the index virus and the other earlier variants, so alpha, beta, gamma, delta, are no longer being detected in humans. The trajectory of further SARS-CoV-2 evolution indicates that XBB will likely be the progenitor of SARS-CoV-2 variants in the near term. There is in vitro evidence, and this can be interesting, that immune imprinting, which is a phenomenon in which B cell memory recall responses towards previously encountered antigen reduce the response to new antigens, may be occurring. However, based on observational epidemiological studies to date, the clinical impact remains unclear. I'm sort of amazed at how much mileage people have made, of what you can see here is a very qualified statement. Preclinical data shared confidentially with the TAG-CoVac by vaccine manufacturers show that vaccination with XBB.1 descendant lineage containing candidate vaccines elicits higher neutralizing antibody responses to currently circulating SARS-CoV-2 variants compared to responses elicited by currently approved vaccine. And here the punch. One approach recommended is the use of a monovalent XBB.1 descendant lineage, such as XBB.1.5. Now, I do want to leave in an extra link here to Immune 68, Sins and Blessings of Immunity. Certainly worth listening to, and then even going on to read some of the linked articles. Maybe a discussion about original antigenic sin and what we know versus what we think we know. And maybe I'll pause here for a moment, Vincent, if you want to sort of comment, because you were involved in that discussion on immune.
Yeah, so that's originally antigenic sin. Originally it's described with influenza virus, where your first encounter with the virus, that's what you make an antibody response to when you get subsequent infections, until such time that the virus changes substantially, and then you make a new response to that new antigen. And so this is going on with SARS-CoV-2. People who are infected with, say, XBB.1.15, right? Any XBB.1.1 lineage, they're mostly making a response to the ancestral virus, which is no longer circulating, and those antibodies don't neutralize infection very well. So that's I think what original antigenic sin is, or imprinting. And some people are concerned because you want to make antibodies that neutralize what's ever around. But as they say in this statement, and as Paul Offit has said, the clinical relevance isn't clear, because in the WHO presentation, actually, Kanta Subbarao, who was on the TAG-CoVac, this WHO advisory committee, she said, we're erring on the safe side. We're not sure that declining neutralization is clinically relevant, but if in certain people, if you allow infection to go more than it normally would, that's a problem for them. It's not a problem for everyone, but it's a problem for certain people. And they're erring on the side of caution. That's what they're doing here. I mean, and she admitted it's totally on antibody neutralization data, no T cells. And I asked another person on the committee, what about T cells? And he said, we know they're there. The epitopes don't change. What do you want to know? Oh boy, okay, I touched a nerve or something like that.
It is interesting. They would say, "Oh, but they're so hard to measure." But I think the consensus is that the T cell protection, the T cell memory is durable.
Yes.
So I understand, and I think this is maybe the important distinction that we need to kind of get people's heads wrapped around, is that if we're trying to boost and get 3 to 4 months of neutralizing high level mucosal antibodies, it doesn't make sense to use something that's not going to provide a neutralizing antibody at those sites.
That's right.
But then the other question is, how important and in whom do we need to keep, updating and doing this? And it's going to be hard if we say, oh, we're erring on the side of caution in such a way that we're not going to get the science. We're just going to sort of keep, rolling the dice in a way that we think is, So I'm a little bit concerned about the lack of science.
That's a problem, because we still don't know the correlates that prevent severe disease, right?
Yeah.
So antibodies are part of it, but there's also non-neutralizing antibodies with FC functions.
Hmm.
There's T cells, as you say. There's probably complement. So you would like to you would like to have a better understanding. For flu, we have a good understanding. When the neutralizing antibodies drop below a certain level, we change the vaccine because we know that's accompanied by more severe disease. But we don't know that yet for SARS-CoV-2. So they're saying, okay, let's use a vaccine that at least induces antibodies to the currently neutralizing variants, circulating variants. And
Yeah.
it's hard to argue with that, but who should get it, right? That's the
Yeah.
problem. And my feeling is, well, you know best, people with health conditions, people over 70 or so, but a 25-year-old that's already had an infection and a couple of vaccines doesn't need an XBB 1.5, right?
I think the challenge is still that long COVID out there, right? As we're still seeing that, and we just had a
Hmm.
rather prominent scientist who, he's been vaccinated to the hilt, everything's great. 2 months later, having cognitive issues, and actually someone that I sort of rely on for their opinion. So I'm a little bit disturbed that they didn't end up in the hospital, they didn't die, but they're having word finding and memory, and so that's kind of our big thing. Is
Yeah.
it would be nice if there was some way to not get infected, but I think there's still a lot of science here that we need to sort out. All right. So what happens? You get infected. Still, number one, Paxlovid, but a little bit of an update here. We have a new resource, the Dosing and Prescribing Reference Guide from Pfizer. I'll leave a link here. And this actually links to a nice resource, including an FDA Paxlovid patient eligibility screening checklist tool for prescribers. Leave a link for that as well. It's nice. You sort of go through a checklist, what's the age, comorbidities. Okay, this is a candidate. Then you can go through renal function, and then they have a really nice color coded, what medicines are they on and how do I navigate these waters? Because remember, this, and we'll talk about this maybe in future episodes, but you can't put all your eggs in the vaccine basket. There's individuals who get infected, even though they've been vaccinated. We still have over 1,000 people here in the States dying every week, right? More when you look around the world. This is another tool to jump in with. Number two, remdesivir when you can get it, molnupiravir, convalescent plasma in certain settings. And remember, let's not do harmful things. Moving into the second week, the cytokine storm, the lower respiratory hypoxic phase in some folks, the early inflammatory. That's when we talk about steroids, anticoagulation, pulmonary support, immune modulation. And I will then move into, very briefly, the late phase, long COVID. As a teaser, I will say that next week I will be discussing a JAMA article on PASC that is still under embargo at the time of this recording. So I can't mention it yet, but it will be off embargo and ready for discussion next week. And I expect there to be a lot of strong reactions to this publication. All right. No one is safe until everyone is safe. We're going to hit some emails here in a minute, but pause right here. Go to parasiteswithoutborders.com and click donate. Every little bit helps. We keep talking about the importance of education, but we can only do what we do with your support. Right now, we're having our Foundation International Medical Relief of Children fundraiser. May, June, and July, donations made to PWB will be matched and doubled up to a potential maximum donation of $20,000.
It's time for your questions for Daniel. You can send them to daniel@microbe.tv. Robert writes, I'm 83, recently came down with shingles, despite being fully vaccinated with Shingrix. It was a horrible experience. Months of pain, fatigue, loss of appetite, weight, etc. have not yet fully recovered. In the news, I read that Senator Feinstein was also vaccinated against shingles, and according to news reports, at 89 had a much worse outcome with shingles than I did. Could you comment on these apparent failures of the vaccine to do much to mitigate shingles disease course?
Yeah. So I think this is it's a very timely discussion, and so hopefully this is going to trigger a bunch of people to go out there and make the right decision with their health regarding the Shingrix vaccine, the shingles vaccine. So we have a couple iterations of the shingles vaccine. You get chickenpox when you're younger. Your body keeps it under control for a while. And then about 50% of individuals at some point in their life will have reactivation of that virus and will get shingles. The current vaccine is a protein-based vaccine. It's almost like a Novavax, for shingles, and it has varying degrees of efficacy, right? So the overall efficacy that we suggest is about 85%, but then maybe this is easy to remember. Only about 80% if you're over 80. Right. So do run the numbers, right? So you go into this world with a 50% chance that you're going to have shingles after that chicken pox. You get a vaccine that's 80% effective. You still have a 10% chance that you're going to end up with the shingles. And unfortunately, as you describe, as we hear with the senator, shingles can be bad, and particularly if it involves dermatomes up in the head and the face. I recently, unfortunately, had a gentleman in his 70s who started off with facial shingles, actually became encephalitic, otherwise had no other medical problems, ended up going down the comfort care route and died despite being on antiviral medication. So, you're going to take your 50-50, you're going to drop it down to maybe a 5 or 10% risk, depending upon your age, when you get the vaccine, other problems. But no, these vaccines are not 100%.
Alex writes, I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the new Mpox outbreak in Chicago, specifically that a majority of the patients received both shots of the vaccine, and it seemed we largely were able to beat we were largely able to beat the virus back. How do you think we should interpret these events in terms of the potential for wider spread, and what is responsible for this resurgence?
Yeah, so this is great. These are great discussions. So thank you for emailing in and bringing these up. So, no, I don't think we have any vaccine out there that's truly 100%. Maybe Vincent knows of one. But, if you're in a situation where a person is going to be repeatedly exposed to a pathogen, we can dramatically reduce your risk of having severe disease. We maybe in many cases can reduce the severity of disease should you get infected, right? We've always talked about vaccines don't prevent infection. They might reduce the risk for a period of time. Now, in this case, were those diseases less severe? It's always hard to know in a little group of 5 or 8 or 10. Was it reducing? How bad would the disease have been? And the disease was horrible in a lot of cases. What I worry about is going into the spring and summer, right? When there's potentially going to be a lot of exposure. Have we vaccinated enough people? What are we going to see? I have to say all the data we are seeing is really encouraging with regard to the efficacy of these vaccines, but no, they are certainly not 100%.
I think in some of the trials, the HPV vaccines in certain age groups were close to 100% at protecting against cancer.
Yeah.
That's the best. All right. Clark writes, we are 2 physician spouses, 60 years old and without other risk factors, traveling for 2 weeks in the Mediterranean. We continue to wear N95s, eat meals outdoors, and endeavor to be judicious regarding crowd density. One of us contracted our first case of COVID and started Paxlovid. The second of us turned positive a day later, also began Paxlovid. Are there special precautions we should take to protect one another's full recovery as we pass the 5-day isolation period and make our way through the subsequent 5-day masking only, or until 2 consecutive negative tests separated by 24-hour period? For instance, should one of us isolate from the other for a specific number of days, or is there a reasonable chance that the one continuing Paxlovid and still within the 5-day period could reinfect the other?
Yeah. So, in the story you lay out, and this is a story we saw many times played out, most likely you both were infected from a common source, probably have, the same variant. I would not be particularly concerned that you're going to be passing it back and forth, reinfecting one another. Your immune system is starting to respond. The medication is playing a role here. So no, in general, our advice is if you end up in a situation like this, you just sort of weather the storm together. And I wouldn't recommend any special precautions, sort of protecting yourself from one another.
Ann writes, just got my first COVID diagnosis, tested positive a day after symptoms, assumed getting Paxlovid would be pretty straightforward, but the covering doctor at my medical group flat out refused. His statements justifying his decision. He claims Omicron, that's his term, doesn't affect the lungs in the same way. He claims Paxlovid triggers a rebound, not my understanding from your podcasts. He also claimed that 5 days after my first positive test, I could consider myself non-contagious, regardless of my COVID test, also not my understanding. Has something changed recently? I no longer listen weekly the way I did the first few years of the pandemic, or am I talking to the wrong doctor?
Yeah, so you're talking to the wrong doctor, and I'm hoping something will change in the near future, and is that you will actually get a competent clinician to take care of you. I mean, this is really. You can imagine how frustrating this is. We have over 1,000 people dying every week still. What is a common denominator there, right? At this point, there's all a level of immunity. The common denominator is these individuals not getting offered that early treatment. I'm hoping that's going to change once this medication is fully licensed, once we can rely on better education. But no, this is a misinformed, poorly educated clinician offering horrible advice.
And finally, Mary writes, during TWiV 1008, you answered Roland's question about using Symbicort, an inhaled steroid, during the first week of COVID infection by saying it's the systemic steroids that should be avoided. This caught my attention because Paxlovid is in my plan should I contract COVID. My doctor agrees I should suspend my use of Flovent inhaled steroid for asthma as soon as I start taking Paxlovid, since it is on the list of conflicting medications with Paxlovid. I'm elderly, have suffered pneumonia several times in my life, so I'm super careful to avoid contracting COVID. I want my plan to be sound, as I'm pretty sure I'll be experiencing COVID cough if I do get it.
Yeah, so great. Thank you for sending in that email. So that is an interesting little thing that I am glad you bring up. Is you do always have to be careful. There can be drug interactions with the Paxlovid and some of the inhalers that folks are using. But yeah, that was the really big distinction in the science, right? People that are getting systemic steroids, so people getting prednisone, dexamethasone, etc., those Medrol dose packs, which cost a ridiculous amount when someone could just get prednisone in a situation like that, those are increasing the risk of progression by 5 to 6-fold, increasing the risk of mortality by about 35%. So that's bad. But we did study the inhaled steroids. The inhaled steroids didn't offer any benefit, but they were not associated with that harm.
I want to just go back to Anne's email. She says she hasn't listened every week like she did at the beginning of the pandemic. And I would say you ought to, because just think how smart you're going to be if you listen every week. That's the best way to learn, to listen to things over and over. And you never know when something new is going to come up. So I don't see any negatives. Do you, Daniel?
No, I only see positives. Education is a positive thing. We encourage you to listen every week.
That's TWiV Weekly Clinical Update with Dr. Daniel Griffin. Thank you, Daniel.
No, thank you. And everyone, be safe.